This video will contain all of the spoilers. You have been warned. So I had this thought. What if I made a video that hit dislike numbers so high that it would be years before I had to watch another video beat that record? And so let's talk about why I think The Last of Us Part 2 is an attempt at the next evolution of video game storytelling, and why I think that as gamers, we just aren't ready for it yet, and maybe we never will be. First off, the mastery. The Last of Us Part 1 was revolutionary. It changed our outlook on the medium by showing us that video games really could tell a mature story as effectively as any other media. Enter Part 2, which looked at the Mount Everest scaled by its predecessor, laughed, and turned its gaze to the sky. Part 2 said, I'm gonna take a bucket full of story elements that novels and film have struggled with for decades, and take a swing at proving that games can tell any story. And as I'm sure you're aware, that swing wasn't quite a hole-in-one. So first things first, let's talk about the subtle storytelling. Video games are an art form. I'm not here to argue that. But The Last of Us Part 2 is in uncharted waters because it's only been a handful of years since we achieved the technical ability required to use video games as a form of cinematic storytelling. I'm talking tech levels that allow the use of show don't tell, where you can analyze the actor's subtle body language and complex facial expressions, the photorealistic set pieces, and even the cinematography for tiny details the director included to drive home a plot point. As Marla Arush put it is more and more an actor-driven medium today than it was before. We understand that nuances make a difference and that the actor is important to push the reality into the environment. Nuance is the key word here, and The Last of Us Part 2 takes that word and runs with it. Not just in the acting, but in all corners of the narrative. But this is a new set of legs both for the industry and for us as players. So is it any surprise that we're flailing around a little? And so we stumble into The Last of Us Part 2 and we consume the art for what it is at surface level, a game. But this game is secretly trying to be more. It's trying to pull off the subtlety of an art house film, while covering that subtlety in familiar plot, gorgeous graphics that encourage the eye to wander, and flashy gameplay that keeps the standard player far too distracted to analyze the story. And yet the success of the story depends on you analyzing it because it doesn't state its deeper themes plainly, it expects you to dive for them. The biggest twist of The Last of Us Part 2 was Dunkey liking it. The second is that it can't even really be called a story about how revenge is bad, because that's too reductionist to be considered an accurate description of the overall experience. Revenge is bad is like a golf club, and the game picks it up, walks over, and hits you over the head with it. Naturally, you close your eyes, and so the next blow hits, and then the next, and you resign yourself to the repetitive torture that will be the next 25 hours.
It is revenge is bad and hurts the people around you over and over and over again.
But here's the twist. If through the frustration and the anger and the pain, you force your eyes open, you'll find there's actually a whole caddy worth of different clubs, and Neil Druckmann is switching them out between each swing. And sure, you'll still walk away upset and battered, and maybe trying to figure out what all the messages were will give you more of a headache, but at least you'll have gotten more out of the experience. Many close their eyes, and why wouldn't they? Who would expect a whole caddy worth of clubs to precede the heckin' chonker of a message that is revenge is bad? But the reality is that the story is about so much more. It's about the long road to recovery from loss and trauma, the personal toll of obsession and hatred. How these four things paired together can rob us of control, change who we are, and all the while blind us to those changes. It's an experiment in biases and how easy it is to forget that our view of a scene is completely dependent on what side we're standing on. It's about forgiveness, both of others and of ourselves. About the importance of a purpose in life. And yes, it's about the cost of revenge, the lack of payoff, and the cycle of violence. Viewing this story through the wide-ass lens that is revenge is bad is always gonna make it look flat. And yet looking at it through every lens it offers up will likely make the image too busy. But the nice thing about there being so many different messages is it gives you the option to focus on the one that resonates most with you. But of course, the problem with letting people fill in the blanks left by subtle storytelling is some people are guaranteed to walk away from the story with an incomplete picture. Especially when many key pieces of context are delivered in details, messages, and even exchanges that can be easily missed due to playstyle. And when it comes to themes, those who saw nothing beyond revenge is bad filled in the blanks with the one color they've been explicitly handed and walked away with a black piece of paper. And so is it any surprise that they're scoffing at anyone calling this game art? Is that a flaw in the game? No. Is that a flaw in us as the player? No, I don't think so. I think that that's growing pains that come from a game trying to be more than what we expect a game to be. One of the places I think this is most notable is when Abby kills Joel from her POV. If you focus on just her face, you'll find so much that's otherwise unsaid. The conflict, the brief look of confusion, disappointment, and vulnerability. The way the acting is trying to convey that this didn't bring the relief she expected. But when a game scene plays out, many don't watch it as they would a scene in a film. Eyes don't lock onto the actors the same way, and in fact, many don't even view the characters as actors at all. At least not yet. And this was a game that treated those subtleties like a confirmed method of conveying information.
Even inside that moment, he goes, do it all over again. And the fact that that moment doesn't come through without a line of dialogue, if anything, falls on my failure to be able to present that moment. But rest assured, that moment is there for Joel.
And that's not to say that if you hated The Last of Us Part 2 that you weren't thinking hard enough or analyzing hard enough. In fact, many of the haters noticed subtleties in the audio and game design that I didn't. The difference is that missing subtleties in gameplay lets you walk away having enjoyed the game, whereas missing subtleties in story ruins the experience. And speaking of differences in what people notice and how people consume art, let's talk about how the game is an exercise in shifting opinions. This game constantly asks you to reevaluate your stance, your thoughts, your biases, and all in an effort to get you to take a step back and view the characters not as standing on sides at all, but as they truly are. Two humans trying to cope with loss by searching for their own forms of acceptance and forgiveness. There is no us versus them, no me versus her. By the end, the line in the sand is washed away and you're left standing knee-deep in a dark sea of internal conflict. On a narrative level, the game explores this pretty blatantly in Abby's current day arc, where she goes from viewing Scars as other to seeing Lev and Yara as people worthy of saving. But we also experience this in a more nuanced fashion through the Ellie to Abby POV switch and the resulting empathy that comes from seeing the world through someone else's eyes. There's a short story by Andy Weir called The Egg, and Kurzgesagt, the channel that's always killing animated birds in the name of science.
Kurzgesagt.
They did a video on it, so I will link it in the places because it was great. But it's basically about a human who has died and is now conversing with a godlike being. And it's told in an odd perspective blend of first and second person where the human is referred to as you. And this god goes on to tell you that you will be reincarnated as a Chinese peasant girl in 540 AD, which confuses you because that's backwards in time. But the god goes on to say that time doesn't matter and every single person who's ever lived has been an incarnation of you, all with the goal of bringing you to enlightenment. Every time you victimize someone, you are victimizing yourself. Every act of kindness you've done to yourself. The Last of Us Part 2 does just that by putting you in the role of protagonist and then in the role of character you've identified as the antagonist. Every crime you commit essentially becomes one against yourself. Killing Joel, Nora, Mel, Jesse, Owen. These are all people you loved and all people you eventually kill. But then so too are the acts of mercy done to yourself. And so to do this section justice, I have to talk about Joel's death. This was rough for everyone involved. And for a lot of people, the anger born of this scene manifested as cries that Joel's death was disrespectful to his character, that it was the destruction of everything the first game stood for, and that it was done for nothing but shock value. Many people wholeheartedly believe that the game could have instead killed Dina or even Tommy and had Joel take Ellie on a nice family murder vacation. Those people are grieving, and I understand that their anger is a stage of that grief. But Joel had to die. We had to be seething, livid, craving Abby's death. The thought of forgiveness had to bring a spiteful chuckle, because only this level of hatred could make us understand what Ellie's going through. Because it makes her struggle our struggle, and it makes her hate our hate. Yes, this makes the humanization of Abby later outrageously uncomfortable, but that's the point. It's uncomfortable to realize that your enemy is just another person, that they feel love and hate, that they have family and fears, that they play with dogs. But that's life. Would humanizing her before Jill's death have made the game easier? Made you like Abby more at the end? Made it less emotionally exhausting? Fuck yes. But it would have taken away the experience at the heart of this story, and with it, our chance to understand Ellie's struggles at a depth most narratives could never dream of diving to. Now, it would be unfair of me to move on from this section without at least acknowledging the plot hole complaints surrounding Joel's death. And there are a lot of them. And that makes sense. This section was always going to face more scrutiny than the rest of the game because emotionally we don't want the death to happen, so we're hunting for an immersion break. And so I had this whole list of nitpick complaints and then another list of subtle details, notes, and lines to cut them down. But when it comes down to it, I don't think it's worth my time or yours. If you felt the game was unrealistic, I don't think my providing a laundry list of details will change your overall impression of the game. And to be fair to those complaining, the original script had a few hours of Abby infiltrating Jackson, which was ultimately cut to preserve pacing and stay focused on what matters. And so if this scenario wasn't your first choice in the logic department, just know that it wasn't the writers either. But there's one defense so persuasive that I can't not provide it, because I think it instantly destroys any and all complaints that Joel trusting strangers made no sense.
What are you drinking?
Coffee.
Where'd you get that?
Those people that came through last week.
You see, in Joel's mind, strangers equal coffee. What if these strangers have coffee? How was Joel supposed to know that all they had was tea? Too soon? I'll see myself out. But speaking of ambitiously terrible puns, let's talk about the ambitiousest narrative structure. Because with our hatred good and stoked to volcanic levels, our teeth gritted, determined to kill Abby, the game sets out to do the impossible, change our mind. And the major way it does this is through the careful delivery of flashbacks. We start out seeing Ellie as protagonist, so we're primed to justify her actions. And for those of us who right away saw the similarities between the quest that she's going on and the quest that Abby went on, we bend over backwards trying to reassure ourselves that the situations are different. And so I found myself thinking, oh, it's just because she has no idea what Joel did.
Only they were immune, right?
Oh, but she sort of does? That's fine, it's because she never confronted him and she—
Don't you fucking touch me!
Okay, it's actually because things with Joel ended badly and she has no sense of—
I don't think I can ever forgive you for that, but I would like to try.
God damn it, Naughty Dog, let me love Ellie! And so piece by piece, I found myself dismantling Ellie's pedestal until she was left knee-deep in the murky depths of moral conflict. And on the other side, the same is done with Abby. In the first flashback, we learn her motives and how her father was her guiding light. In her second flashback, we see the way obsession in the face of his loss is shaping her, in some ways quite literally, since her muscles are a thick representation of that obsession.
I pushed 185 pounds yesterday.
And we also see how the obsession is standing in the way of what could be a good life with Owen.
I'm sorry.
Don't be sorry. Talk to me.
But Joel's still out there, you know? Let's go back. We can still make training.
And in the third, as well as later in her entire present day arc, we see the consequences of her losing her fight with the obsession. And she loses everything. Every time I see the meme, name a character who suffered more pain than her, I die a little bit inside because does nobody see Abby? But that is the point, isn't it? Piece by piece, we're reminded that she's human, capable of mistakes, susceptible to consequences, but also worthy of redemption. Sound familiar? And for me, this was enough to make my grip loosen so she could burst from the water and stumble to her feet to find herself on even ground with Ellie. Many felt that this game was trying to turn Abby into a hero and Ellie into a villain, to make us love Abby and hate Ellie. But to me, the beauty of the story is the great many ways in which they were shown to be exactly the same, and I think the game was always trying to get them onto level ground. It's just impossible to get everyone to the same baseline when we start from such extreme positions. But the two women are sharing the same journey in so many ways, and the parallels between the 4 arcs are so fascinating and so commonly overlooked. Abby's flashbacks convey her core issue, which is her lack of control in the face of obsession, hatred, and rage, mirroring Ellie's current day issue. In the face of losing this fight, her present-day struggle becomes one of finding light in a world of darkness, of finding a new purpose, and forgiving herself and those around her. Sound familiar? These are Ellie's core issues from her flashbacks. And in the end, both women resolve their own core flaw to some degree, but succeed even further in overcoming their secondary flaws. I think a really big misconception that ruins the flashbacks for a lot of people is the idea that they exist for the viewer, when in reality, every flashback is meant to be something that character is reliving in the moment. For Ellie, many of these memories are ones she's avoided and is now facing for the first time since Joel's death. For Abby, all of her flashbacks are dreams, with one exception, which is discovering the aquarium, which has a very clear trigger. This seemingly simple shift actually adds a lot. For Abby, the nightmares and dreams exist to show us how killing Joel worsened her nightmares, how guilt and regret hang over her head, and finally, how she finds peace. It isn't until after she's faced her worst fear to help save Yara that her nightmare turns to a dream in which she opens the door at the end of that long hallway and finds not a horror scene, but her father smiling at her, a clear indication that she feels she's finally on the right path, the path he would have wanted.
What happened to us? Maybe we stopped looking for the light.
Ellie's memories, on the other hand, exist to show us how much she's been avoiding thoughts of Joel, and how her slowly confronting them across the game is the real reason she lets Abby go at the end and finds some degree of peace. Ellie's memories exist to show us her journey to healing, which brings us to an unambiguously ambiguous ending. If that subtitle confused you and seemed like it wasn't worth taking the time to unpack, then know it's by design. Because what was the ending of The Last of Us Part 2 but something hard to unpack, where those who were already exhausted by the story and just wanted an end to the depression were forced to decide whether it was worth their time to search for depth they didn't expect to find. Well, rest assured, I'm going to unpack for you what I found in the ending of The Last of Us Part 2. Not the title of this section though. I'm not showing my hand on whether there's depth there or not. Anyways, firstly we have Abby. She doesn't matter, at least not for this. The menu screen changes from the dark, depressing image of the boat at the end to the warm sunset shot of the boat on Catalina Island, which is a clear hint that Abby and Lev made it to the Fireflies. That's it. That's all the unpacking I'm gonna do for you, because Abby finished her arc by this point. And the final fight scene isn't about Abby at all, and that's something I will unpack, because this section is actually all about Ellie's baggage. Remember how I said Ellie's memories are things she's thinking about in the moment? Now with that in mind, consider this. Ellie had her last talk with Joel right before he died, so she never had time to parse it. And then after he dies, she largely tries to avoid thinking about him and their time together. We see this even years later when she's at the farm and the way she calls JJ Potato instead of the nickname that seemingly stands for Jesse Joel. Or maybe Joel Jesse, though I'd argue that's a dumb name. She also draws Joel without eyes and says in her diary that she doesn't want to talk about him. And so the flashbacks throughout Seattle aided in her healing, but she's forced to abandon her mission to get Dina to safety before she has a chance to confront the memory of that last day. And as a bonus attempt to make us truly understand the lack of closure that ends up driving her from that farmhouse, the game gives us the dance scene, letting us for a brief time believe that her last real memory of Joel was tainted by her primary flaw, her inability to even consider forgiveness. Flash forward to the final fight. She has Abby pinned under the water, and then Abby bites off her 2 fingers. It's not a stretch to say that she realizes in this moment that it will cost her the guitar. And then she gets that flash of him on the porch, that last memory she has yet to face. But then she does still have the memories of him, right? The ones she's been avoiding, and no one can take those from her, except one person, herself. If she keeps holding Abby down, if the body struggling under her grasp suddenly goes still, those memories will be forever tied to this killing act. Whenever she thinks of Joel, she'll think of what she did, and there may come a day when those thoughts are of regret. And then she will truly lose herself, because if she can't forgive Abby for killing Joel, will she ever really be able to forgive herself for killing Abby? In releasing Abby here, she isn't just letting Abby live, she's letting herself live. And she's letting Joel's memory live, untainted. Another aspect of this scene is the question that the flashback poses, though we as the player don't hear it until later.
If somehow the Lord gave me a second chance at that moment, I would do it all over again.
4 years down the road, when Ellie looks back at this moment, would she have the same answer? And what would Joel think if he saw her like this, about to put a lifetime burden of guilt on her shoulders? A burden that he bore only for her, but where her action would save no one, achieve nothing. Needlessly killing Abby is in a way a disrespect to Joel's memory and sacrifice. And since Abby's action was a consequence of Joel's crimes, in a way, forgiving her is a representation of forgiving Joel, which is what Ellie is truly doing in this moment. In fact, in this moment, everything really stops being about Abby at all and becomes about Joel. And Ellie facing her core flaw, which is her inability to forgive, as well as her conquering Abby's greatest flaw, obsession. The true victory here is in letting go, because that's the only way she can truly take back control. One of the big things that makes people hate this game is the lack of true payoff for Ellie. But what they aren't seeing is that this journey, however costly, did at least lead to her forgiving Joel, and thus his memory can be consolation to her. She didn't lose all of him. And she doesn't even get the wholly pessimistic ending that most people see when the credits roll. The main key to seeing the hope in Ellie's ending is in Abby and Owen's sex scene. I know, okay, let me explain. So Abby's present arc is a representation of the sorts of things that Ellie would go through if she'd killed Abby. Now, from the aquarium flashbacks, we see that Owen and Abby broke up because she couldn't put him over her obsession.
We can't miss training.
Really? Not even just for one night.
I'm sorry.
I told you already. Don't be sorry.
No, I wish someone loved me enough to make me a stocking.
You don't deserve one.
What, a stocking? Or someone who loves me?
You should blow off training tonight when the moon comes out.
I found Joel's brother.
Sound familiar?
We've got a family. She doesn't get to be more important than that.
And so why aren't they together after Joel's death? They obviously still have feelings for each other. Is it Mel? Are they dragging their feet? Is it awkwardness? The sex scene shows that it can't be any of these things. And all the while pointing us to the real reason. It's Joel. The resentment, hate, and bitterness tied to his death, the brutal act they shared that can't be washed away. This, it's a flower. This isn't passion. The nuance in the acting of the roughness, the facial expressions, the jerky movements, the lack of closeness and eye contact. They'll never be able to be together because the shadow of Joel will always haunt them, tainting their relationship. But Ellie proves she could overcome the obsession, and maybe this will be enough for Dina to try to make things work. And I think this is actually really clearly hinted at in that final scene. She arrives at the farmhouse, but her backpack has no weapons. Odd, she surely wouldn't have left them in Santa Barbara. She has Dina's bracelet on, which she wasn't wearing on the beach. And though she looks sad, she doesn't knock and she doesn't call out for Dina, almost like she knows it will be empty. To me, this says she's already been back to Jackson, already talked to Dina, because Dina would be in Jackson with JJ's grandparents, as per the note that you find in the farmhouse before Ellie leaves. And so the final scene exists to show that Ellie has found closure. She leaves the guitar at the end. She doesn't need it to connect with Joel anymore, and it's become a symbol of how close she came to being truly lost. It isn't a hopeless ending, it's just one where the light isn't handed to you. You have to go looking for it. Speaking of things not being handed to people, let's talk about the hurdles this game faced related to those uncharted corners of video game storytelling. let's talk about the miserable. Every innovation comes with a new set of challenges. This innovation actually just came with a bunch of old challenges drawn from film and novels, the era of BioShock, and the depths of the internet itself. But there were new challenges for Naughty Dog. So first off, the challenge that novels and film know so well: emotional fatigue. If you look up games with the most heartbreaking endings, you'll already find The Last of Us Part 1 all over the list. Games don't tend to go darker and more soul-crushing than that, but The Last of Us Part 2 did. And brave as it was, I don't think it's a surprise that it failed for so many people, especially in the face of one key question. What makes a story good? Is it a story that makes you feel good? Or is it a story that makes you feel? I think it would be unfair of me to say that there's a right answer here, but I know my answer. I consume stories and art to experience lives, thoughts, and feelings outside of myself. I find value in these even when they're overwhelmingly negative. But it is always a narrative risk, and for a game to take this step, it's a whole other story. With films, you're locked in for 2 to 3 hours. Whereas The Last of Us Part 2, you're looking at 25 hours, which means multiple days to weeks of turning on that game and facing that stress. And we tend to associate games with the word fun, but as Neil Druckmann said in an interview with BuzzFeed, with The Last of Us specifically, we don't use the word fun. We say engaging, and it might seem like a minor distinction, but it's an important one to us. That's a distinction they've had years to adapt to, but for the average player, this game goes against all standard expectations and instincts for picking up a controller. And while this is an IP in the horror genre, and the first game certainly wasn't all kittens and strawberries, it punctuated the horror with lighthearted jokes, father-daughter bonding, and giraffes. And this one gives us mostly just depression. The aquarium and the museum were beautiful ways to let us catch enough breath to hold us over through the deep dives that came after. But most of us just didn't have the lung capacity to get out without some light choking. And besides, even these are viewed through the lens of loss. And these types of feelings are hard to face in the best of times, but we don't live in the best of times. We live in 2020. The brain prioritizes, and fictional stress is low on the list. And so for those of us starting at a high stress baseline, our minds encourage us to push the game away, attack it, devalue moments through mockery, or just dismiss it as a disappointment not worth any further thought. After all, $60 is a lot of money, so many players power through games they don't necessarily want to finish. And I don't blame people for doing these things. These are coping mechanisms, and maybe these people really need them. But I can't help but wonder how this game would have performed if it had released 2 years ago, where we weren't drowning in negative emotions on a daily basis, and thus feeling so many of them at once in the game could be more novel than soul-crushing. And if overcoming the conditioning born of a game giving us nothing but negative emotions wasn't hard enough, we had a tsunami worth of biases on our head before we even hit the download button. Let's talk about the marketing and the leak. For many people, the leak was all it took to make them decide that they hated this game. Not even that they would hate it, which implies that they'd at least give it a fair chance, but that they already did. And those wanting to defend against the hate had no game, and thus nothing but straws to use against the extreme countering opinions. Whereas those who viewed the leak as proof that the game was gonna be absolute garbage had enough kindling to set the internet on fire. I've never even eaten a leek. I don't know what they taste like. It smells like an onion. Is it an onion? I don't know. Now my hands smell like onions. I regret everything. This made echo chambers common, left their influence largely unchallenged, and led many to wrap their egos and identities around the idea that the game couldn't possibly be good. And the influence of this is incredibly hard to shake because of a little issue called belief perseverance. Belief perseverance labels the phenomena of maintaining beliefs and theories against explicit conflicting evidence. The standard devices we use normally abuse the incoming discrediting information. We treat it with deliberate misinterpretation that renders it either irrelevant to the belief in question, or even as confirming evidence, or we assign low weight to it, ignore it completely, or confine its validity to a convenient paradigm. Now, belief perseverance became an issue not just with the leak, but with the marketing itself. In an attempt to make everyone come into the game blind, Naughty Dog did a naughty thing, or rather, multiple naughty things. They misled in their marketing, from deceptive interview answers to switched out models in a trailer clip. Now, my natural state of never not working shielded me from the interviews. I avoided all the trailers after the dance one, and I even managed to dodge the leak, though my writer brain spoiled that for me as soon as part 2 was announced. And so I experienced none of this firsthand, which led to me initially thinking it clever. But after more evaluation and thought, I understand why the marketing felt like a betrayal of a standard social contract, and with that, trust. All of these early negative feelings combined to have some effect on essentially all aspects of the game narrative, but one place I found it particularly prevalent was in the labeling of narrative devices as cheap tricks or manipulative storytelling, and thus how this impacted the interpretation of the narrative itself. Coming into this game heavy with the shame of feeling like they were bamboozled by the marketing, the standard fictional experience stood out, tinted in a negative light cast by the word manipulation. Determined to not be bamboozled again, players kept their eyes sharp, ever on the hunt for trickery. There's a saying in the medical world: when you hear hooves, think horse, not zebra. And so when players heard hoofbeats, they thought surely this must be a manipulative horse. Not like Shimmer, who is a good horse, rest in peace Shimmer, but like a dirty, cheating, manipulative horse. But surprise, it was actually a zebra. And people hating on the game thought this kinda horse was a cheap trick, and people praising the game thought it was a clever trick, but still thought it was a horse, but then it was also a cat. Let me explain. Save the Cat is a book, and I have it and it's downstairs, and I'm not gonna go get it because I'm lazy. But it's named for the type of scene where we meet the hero, and the hero does something, like saving a cat, that defines who he is and makes us, the audience, like him. Enter the zebra scene. Now, I watched the scene for the first time, knowing what Save the Cat was, but what I saw here wasn't Save the Cat, and it wasn't a scene trying to make Abby out to be the hero. What I saw was her hesitation. It isn't Abby who wants to check on the zebra. It isn't Abby who runs up to the fence. And when the real hero of the scene tells Abby to come help, she's resistant. For me, this scene was meant to show Abby's moral weakness and her reliance on her father's morality to guide her, to show that he's the one encouraging her to help people, which then tells us why she fell so far when he died. If anything, the scene is Save the Catting her father, and I guess you could call that manipulation, as many people did in a great many videos, but I'd argue that the whole point of fiction can essentially be boiled down into manipulating you into feeling things. When I write a scene where I want the reader to cry, I'm specifically using tools and tricks to make the reader cry, and readers love it. That's why they picked up the book, was to feel things. But they don't think of it as a manipulation in the moment. The negativity preceding the release, however, made people think about it. Additionally, many saw Ellie killing Alice as the game saying, "See, she kills dogs. She's the real villain. Abby saves zebras."
The subtext here is extremely obvious. Ellie bad. Ellie kills animals. Abby good. She saves animals.
But the same people then skip over the whole bit where Lev, who fills the role of innocent in this game, raises his bow and nearly kills Alice. Both are in self-defense, the only difference is Mel diffuses the situation when Lev faces it. Ultimately, I think that the degree to which people hit these issues is rooted in personality, as well as the degree to which they were exposed to the mess leading up to the game. And I want to be clear that I'm not insulting anyone who fell into these biases. In reality, many such biases are at times an important part of cognition. Many of the mechanisms that distort our judgment stem from basic cognitive processes that are usually quite helpful in accurately perceiving and understanding the world. But this being a normal part of the cognitive process doesn't mean that we should leave it unchallenged. And holy hell, does this game challenge your biases at every turn. And so let's talk about ludonarrative dissonance and avatar bias. Avatar bias is a term sometimes used to describe the sense that because a video game character is controlled by the player, they are an avatar of said player, and thus their actions are player actions. In books and film, you can make the POV character do anything. Stab a baby? Sure. Boil a puppy? I'm not sure how it's relevant to the plot, but go for it. At the end of the day, the audience may hate the character, but they won't feel judged, guilty, or as if their ego is under attack. The same isn't true of video games, and this can lead to an issue called ludonarrative dissonance. Ludonarrative dissonance is a term I discovered through BioShock, as it was coined in a 2007 article by game scriptwriter Clint Hawking, which focused on a particular issue he'd noticed within the game. By throwing the narrative and ludic elements of the work into opposition, the game seems to openly mock the player for having believed in the fiction of the game at all. I won't give spoilers, but what this comes down to is that many players were frustrated by the talk with Ryan in the face of the twist. The clear judgment and how the only way to escape his judgment would be to abandon the game unfinished, which isn't really an option. And so the game's message seems to contradict the very thing you must do to finish the game. A better description of the term is provided by Brett Macindonsky, who describes it as the idea that when a game tells the player one thing through its story and environment, and then contradicts it through gameplay, the player becomes unimmersed and disconnected from the experience to a degree. This is exactly what many people feel in The Last of Us Part 2.
So the game makers are forcing us to use this sort of violence and then asking us if that violence is bad.
How I said Ellie is forced to kill a dog? Yeah, it's Abby's dog, and they not once, but 2 separate times force you to play catch with the dog to make you feel guilt and shame.
They're like, oh, the game is like, I kill a dog in 1 second and I pet the dog, so the game is like wagging its finger at me. I was like, the game is not making any judgments. The game is just presenting, here are some acts, and here's another view on those same acts.
Taken as a whole, though, I think it's possible to acknowledge that contradiction without throwing away what the narrative is doing successfully.
And I could argue all day about how this is a post-apocalypse, and self-defense kills in this world aren't as morally questionable, they're survival, and I could argue about how no-kill runs are possible for huge parts of the game, how Alice is the only dog you have to kill, how if you provoke each enemy, the only kills you commit that aren't in some degree self-defense are Nora, who was already dying at that point, and Joel, but when it comes down to it, the game is handing you an arsenal of weapons, a herd of dogs, a couple hundred enemies, and just setting you loose on Seattle. I could argue that the right answer is rarely the easy and obvious one, but you could then argue the gamification of the narrative is clearly built primarily on the killing of enemies, and I could argue that they did this because it's what's expected of the game, but you could then argue that while they're pushing boundaries, why not push the killing enemy focus core of most action games? And we would go in circles forever. Because even if players can accept this as a story to the point of not seeing avatar bias, to where they always say Ellie and Abby rather than you and I, there were always gonna be players who use mostly stealth kills, and where in the absence of the self-defense argument, Ellie's reaction to killing Nora after slicing across Seattle will undoubtedly feel hypocritical. And so in defense of those who hate The Last of Us Part 2, I do feel like in many ways the game expects you to give it a standard cost of gamification pass here, but then expects you to view it as cinematic in other sections. Which leaves people feeling like, as Clint said in his BioShock article, we are mocked after a 20-hour commitment for having sympathy for the limitations of a medium. And I get that giving the player options would have ultimately taken away from Ellie's arc to some degree, since it's important we see her lack of control, but I would argue that removing stealth kills would have been an alternate way to alleviate some of the dissonance. But then again, would you have enjoyed the game without stealth kills? I'm actually asking. Drop a comment with your answer. And so I don't think there's any way this game could have eliminated ludonarrative dissonance without a cost to gamification, and some people argue that no game ever will. Which brings us to the age-old debate, ludology versus narratology. This is the question of what should get priority in the event that the two cannot be equally honored, narrative or gameplay. It seems that most people used to argue for gameplay, but over the years that's shifted to a more central ground, because the reality is that the medium is changing too fast for anyone to take a true stance. If you look into this debate, you'll find many of the quotes used today are already too outdated to be relevant. For example, Jesper Jewell, who argued, "The computer game, for all practicality, cannot tell stories. The computer game is simply not a narrative medium." And The Last of Us Part 1 would like to have some words with him, but to be fair, so would he, as he now says, "This thesis was completed in February 1999, and today I may not completely agree with all the conclusions or presuppositions in the text." His first statement was made in the era before PlayStation had a number after its name, so he wasn't wrong. And yet in 2 decades, our stance has completely changed. And so while Brett McIndonsky in his 2012 article says, "The cold hard reality of video games is that they are not realistic. They probably never will be. It's hard to say what 2032 will bring. Hopefully not more pandemic." And so right now we may say that video games cannot tell stories with the nuance of film. But maybe 10 years from now we'll look back and say that in the light of today we may not agree with those conclusions. And just as part 1 opened our eyes to a new world of possibilities, maybe we'll all collectively look back on part 2 and view it as a pioneer in its own right. And so we come to my conclusion, my piece. The next frontier of video game storytelling is no longer guarded by the limitations of technology, but rather the still young science of marrying cinema-grade storytelling with gripping gameplay into some semblance of harmony. And I think that the brunt of this problem falls not on the backs of developers or designers or writers, but on us as the player. The world of gaming is changing, and we as the audience have to change with it. If we find that we can't reach the point where we can view the character on screen as separate and apart from ourselves, then we'll likely see gaming become stagnant in its narratology, and I think that would be a great loss. I don't know if we'll ever succeed at overcoming avatar bias, or even if ludonarrative dissonance can be overcome while preserving gamification. But I think this is the first game to dive this deeply into the problem, and that perhaps we should give it some credit for the ambitious attempt, imperfect as it may be. A masterpiece is defined as a work of outstanding artistry, skill, or workmanship. And though the word perfection often comes up as a synonym for masterpiece, this doesn't apply to art because no narrative can be perfect. In the context of art, I think the word masterpiece can be applied to games that take the tools of the trade and skillfully use them to push the boundaries of the medium. And so, although The Last of Us Part 2 is not free of flaws, in my opinion, it meets the definition of masterpiece. Whatever your thoughts on my thesis may be, I think that at the end of the day we can all agree that Naughty Dog, Neil Druckmann, and the creative team overall could have made a mediocre game that everyone mildly enjoyed. And instead they chose to face death threats so that they could give us a game we'd never experienced before in the hope that it would deeply move a few of us. We should all strive for such a level of bravery and dedication to our art and to the story we want to tell. And that was it for this video. If you liked it, please subscribe, hit the like button, comment, share, all of those things. It really helps, and maybe the algorithm will like it for once. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video.
But I can't walk on the path of the right because I'm wrong. No, I can't walk on the path of the right 'cause I'm